I think we'll get started. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Meg Mackin. I'm Director of Philanthropy for the Mid-Atlantic and Midwest regions at the Foundation for Fighting Blindness. So I have the pleasure of working with donors in the Mid-Atlantic and Midwest. And welcome to the session, RD Fund Biotech Overview. The session will last approximately 65 minutes, and the remaining 20 minutes of the session will be reserved for questions. Please note the session is being audio recorded. If you're using an assisted listening device, please turn to channel 4. And don't forget, please silence your cell phone. The speaker for this session is Dr. Rusty Kelley. I have his bio, which is about 4 pages long. It's very impressive, but he said he just wants to introduce himself. So I will turn it over to Dr. Rusty Kelley.
Great. Thank you for participating. So Rusty Kelley, Senior VP Investments and Alliances, the RD Fund, which is the venture arm of the Foundation Fighting Blindness. The RD Fund stands for Retinal Degeneration Fund. And it's because we're a 501c3 subsidiary of the foundation, and the foundation is the sole member of this 501c3, we are formed to serve the mission of the foundation, and that's to find treatments, preventions, and cures for inherited retinal dystrophies and dry AMD by way of making investments in companies that are seeking to develop therapeutics. And so our investments serve 2 purposes. One, most importantly, to seek a clinical return, and to a financial return. And these are what the field refers to as mission-related investments. And we ultimately behave just like a institutional or a traditional venture capital firm, but we do not have limited partners. Most venture capital firms raise money through institutional investors, through pension funds, et cetera, et cetera. We raise funds through donations. And so those donations come from the Foundation Fighting Blindness. We have a consolidated financial statement. So we really are, even though we are a subsidiary, we have our own 990, and on paper we look independent. We're essentially an extension of the Foundation Fighting Blindness. We've made 12 investments so far. Those investments range from gene therapy and other genetic medicines like RNA therapies. ProCure is a great example of an RNA therapy. And then the classic neuroprotection, which generally applies to mid-stage disease. And then some of the replacement therapies like optogenetics, which most of the people, I believe, were in the optogenetics session right now. But we have 2 optogenetic strategies. One is Videre, and the other is Inspiring Vision. They recently acquired an asset out of Gamut Therapeutics, Denise Delcara at the Institut La Vision. So, yeah, we've deployed a good percentage of the $117.5 million that we've raised so far. These are closed-ended funds, 10-year funds, with some flexibility because we are a nonprofit. We're not beholden to the rules of traditional VC, but we certainly borrow their business practices. But Fund 1 has $73 million under management, and all of those funds are committed. We typically make a small initial investment with a 2x reserve, so 2 times the initial investment goes into a reserve, so that we have enough capital, to invest in the subsequent financing series. And the game here is not to get fully diluted out. So we like to start early, and when you start early, there's a good chance that by the time that therapeutic reaches the market, if it's lucky enough to reach the market, we are lucky enough, the amount of money that it takes to get there is so significant that a lot of the smaller investors that come in early are diluted out. And it's just classic ownership. And as new investors come in, they sort of squeeze out the smaller investors. So that's why we set aside a reserve that allows us to participate in subsequent rounds. We are not passive investors like the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. Because we address so many IRDs, over 300, there's enough activity where we can govern our investments by sitting on the boards, either as voting board directors or board observers. Our board of directors of the RD fund is independent from the FFB board of directors, other than there's automatic appointments from FFB board members to the RD fund. So the chairman of the board has an automatic appointment to the RD fund board. The head of our research oversight committee, John Steinberg, has an automatic appointment to the RD fund board, and the head of our scientific advisory board, Jackie Duncan, has an automatic appointment. So it ties the organizations together. The other board members for the RD fund have other domain expertise. We have an investment banker, Kelley Lisbakken. She's the head of banking for Wedbush Patgrau. So it's really important to have an investment banker in our circle as well. They really touch the markets, and they touch the public markets as well. And that's one of the goals here for our portfolio companies, is to exit at some point. And when we say exit, we mean either going into the public markets, which in itself is not an exit strategy. It's a financing strategy. But some would refer to it as an exit for potential exit for shareholders, because it's a liquidation event, right? You can sell your shares now in the open market as a shareholder if you invested in the company. And then the other form of an exit is to be purchased. So we had one of our companies, we've had 2 exits so far. 2 companies have been purchased. Videri was purchased by Novartis in October of 2019 for a whopping $150 million up front. And if they meet certain milestones, the earn-out milestones, it can be up to $250 million. That's a great example for the foundation, because those funds, as I said earlier, those returns what differentiates us from traditional VC, and it's our version of venture philanthropy, is those returns from Novartis purchasing Videri went back to the foundation fighting blindness to further its mission, and the foundation took some of those proceeds and used them to fill shortfall gaps in the research, the granting budget, and the rest of those funds flowed back into the RD fund too. So we are fundraising currently for RD Fund 2. We've raised approximately $45 million thus far, thanks to this wonderful person in the back, Judy Taylor, and her team. We have a big development team at the foundation that is raising funds from donors in many different ways. Obviously this is bigger capital. The capital needs are much bigger for therapeutic development than they are on the granting side. So we're targeting major donors that are passionate about the investment side of the foundation's strategy. So that's where things are at the moment. We are hopeful that we'll continue to raise capital to allow us to make some new investments. We have approximately $10 million right now that we're looking to deploy, and so I think the name of the game here is to keep doing our diligence on prospective companies that come to us in a variety of different ways, including the foundation. We have these translational awards on the granting side of the foundation that provides a source of new opportunities for us. And in fact, we have a first right of negotiation with those companies, and if these translational research awards that are not early basic science, they're more on the preclinical readiness side. These are the preclinical studies that you conduct to get into the clinics for a first-in-human trial. These TRAP awards, we we're negotiating with a few awardees at the moment, so that the RD fund can manage those granting awards potentially via equity in those companies. So, equity, when we say equity, what we mean is ownership in the company. Just like when you buy stock in the stock market, you become a shareholder. Well, we're a fairly large shareholder in all of our companies, and we don't only do equity. We will do what they refer to as non-dilutive funding, where we're not buying into their equity pool, their capital structure. We're just have an agreement to split the cost to co-develop for a project. We did this with Procure, and we did this with Nocuity. These are two early investments for the RD fund, for the foundation that were wrapped into the RD fund, where it gives us, when you do co-funding strategies like this, it gives you more ground floor visibility into the programs, because you're sharing the cost and you're working together to develop the development strategy. Which animal model are you going to use? The regulatory strategy of getting into your first in-human trial in the U.S. and Europe. Once you're into the clinics, what is your clinical trial design? It gives us more ground floor visibility into that development strategy. So we're flexible. We've even used convertible notes where we're not ready to value a company. And in other words, typically when you do an equity investment in a company, you have to value that equity. There's a valuation to the company that is negotiated between the investors and the owners of the company, the management team of the company. But when you're not ready to value a company, maybe it's too early, you can use a convertible note. And that all that note does, it's sort of a debt vehicle where you make your investment and it converts into the next financing round when there is a valuation. So when there are bona fide investors around the table, they'll value the company, and then your convertible note just gives you the right to convert your dollars into equity, typically at a discount. So I know it's a lot of technical stuff, but it's just to give you a sense that we're flexible when it comes to our investment strategies with among our companies, depending on the stage of the company. We've looked at over 100 companies thus far, and we've probably gone really deep on diligence on probably, I would say, a third of those. And we've made investments in 12. So it gives you a sense of the rate, at which, of investment. I'd say it's around 10%, which is very close to the NIH, probably pretty close to our granting awards at the foundation as well. So there's a lot of words there. Let me just stop and see if there are any questions. Yes, sir.
This is kind of a science question, so if this is unfair, I'll certainly understand. Oh, thank you. Yeah, so this is Dan Day of the Orlando chapter volunteer, and so this is kind of a medical question, so I certainly will understand if you need to defer that to someone, but I think you probably know the answer. You had mentioned optogenetics in conjunction with sparing vision. When I think of optogenetics, I tend to think of Videri with their approach of enabling ganglion cells at the end of the optic nerve to sense light. And sparing vision I kind of associate with this rod-derived cone viability factor. And I guess I didn't realize that was a form of optogenetics. Have I got those two connections right?
Great question, Dan. So I wasn't referring to the RDCVF, the rod-derived cone viability factor gene therapy program, as optogenetics. They have another program that was announced, I believe it was about 6 or maybe 9 months ago. They acquired a company from one of our scientific advisors, Denise Del Cara, who trained in John Flannery's lab, an optogenetics lab at Berkeley, and is now the Institut Vision. She created a company called Gamut Therapeutics, and the target is well, it's not in this case. It's not necessarily a target, but they are transducing dormant photoreceptors with an ion channel called GERK1. And so that's a pipeline early stage program now at Sparing Vision. RDCVF is the lead. So they've added an optogenetic strategy to their portfolio, which is fantastic. And this is, Dan, we can debate the definition of optogenetics, and you're obviously right on. Videre is making non-light sensitive inner retina cells light sensitive. In the case of a dormant photoreceptor, it already has the machinery to be light sensitive. It's just dormant. So we're sort of awakening those dormant, at least that's the theory, right? This has to be proven out. Great question. We can go in a lot of different directions. I know this is a large and tough audience. Rob.
This is a really naive question. I have to either yell or small children, so I project a lot. So you mentioned that you're investing actively. This is a very naive question. I don't do any investing. Why do other philanthropies tend to invest passively and not actively?
I love the question. So, Cystic Fibrosis Foundation trailblazed in this space, but they have one disease, right? So you can imagine that if you develop 10 different therapeutic strategies to address cystic fibrosis, and you're the investor in all 10, well, in essence, you're competing with one another, right? It may be different approaches, different modalities, small molecule, gene therapy, et cetera, et cetera. But if you were to be an active investor for all 10 of those companies, and you're sitting on those boards, then now you've got a real conflict of interest, right? So they're using two classic venture capital firms. One of them is Flagship, and the other one is Lightstone Ventures. And they are investing on behalf of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. Now, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation has this large endowment. We do not. And so that large $3 or $4 billion endowment, if I recall correctly, they have to distribute funds every year. And it's usually 5%. So 5% of, let's say, $5 billion is pretty significant. So how do you deploy that money, to meet, charitable tax deductions, all that sort of thing? One way to do it is to hire a couple of VC firms that like cystic fibrosis as a target. And with Flagship, that's a very interesting model. They just announced this recently. With Flagship, what they're doing is they're saying, okay, well, all these new companies in the Flagship portfolio, big VC firm, they have all these new novel technologies, gene editing, gene augmentation, and base editing, prime editing. They've created this company with Flagship that allows Flagship to pull in those technologies that weren't being previously applied to cystic fibrosis, now applying it to cystic fibrosis. The foundation is different in that we have 300 plus IRDs. Now, 25% of them have yet to be identified, as the elusive genes. But we still have a lot of indications that our clinical consortium, our physicians, our SAB, our grantees are addressing. So it gives us more opportunity to be more active in those investments. We're bound to see conflict at some point where, let's say we have one company going after Stargardt disease via classic gene augmentation, and then another company who's maybe doing gene augmentation but didn't choose Stargardt disease initially and decides to go into Stargardt disease. Well, we have the power, or some power, as governing board directors to sway them in different directions so that we're not competing with one another. That hasn't happened yet, by the way, but it's bound to happen at some point. So that's the downside of being an active investor. But the way you handle that is you have firewalls within your VC fund. So our management team and our board, if we truly did have two competing companies, those of us who were sitting on those board seats would then be recused from any discussion around those indications, around those therapeutic strategies. So we take confidentiality very, very serious. We take conflict of interest very, very serious. We don't want to be on the front page of the New York Times. And so I think we do a really good job governing everything as it relates to the RD fund above board. And again, we have a terrific board, and gentlemen like Warren Thaler, Gordon Gunn himself, who's a board emeritus for the RD fund and a significant anchor donor. Governance is their thing. I mean, they study people, and they study structure, they study conflict, and so it's great that we have that experience, because most of us, and these are early stage investments, so we don't have to get too crazy, but most of us are focused on the science. I've spent most of my career in development, discovery, preclinical, and I've done a little clinical as well. But we're focused on, when we sit on these boards, it's not so much the business. It does matter, of course. It's necessary, but we're focused on what is your development plan and what are your timelines and how much money do you have, and what's your runway. These are classic elements of biotech. It's a long answer to your question. So I love Q&A. You can ask. There's no dumb question. Throw anything at me. This is fun. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So does the foundation provide ongoing support for studies after an initial investment? And then conversely, is funding pulled when performance targets aren't met?
Yes, yeah. No, let's start with the first one. One reason why a lot of the venture capitalists like us is because we bring all of the FFB resources to bear. We have this wonderful registry, for example, of over 20,000 patients, with many of them that have both the genotypic and the phenotypic data that is paramount to selection for clinical trials for various companies. Then we have this clinical consortium that's conducting natural history studies, and this consortium is over 40 or 45 leading eye centers across the world, and they're top-notch investigators and their access to patients. So we bring that to bear. We've used this term that we're smart money, and we truly are. We back that up because for example, I used Stargardt as an example earlier. We've spent $5+ million on ProgStar, the natural history study for Stargardt disease. And that natural history study enlightened the field. And a lot of different companies going after Stargardt disease use this data to understand disease progression. And it sort of illustrated slow, medium, and fast progressors. So if you're a developer, if you're a company, which of those levels of progression do you choose? It's a tough question, right? Because you could be, if you go with the fast progressors, maybe it's too fast. You go with the slow progressors, maybe it's too slow. It take forever to read out. So the goal these days is to do things as quickly as possible and with as few dollars as possible. That's not always the right strategy. The better strategy is maybe really understand the time of intervention, that therapeutic window, and the appropriate endpoints that are associated with it. So we bring to bear those resources. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, FFB has this granting engine. So all of those grantees and their projects we're privy to. They're visible to the RD fund, and if there's something that's investable, a therapeutic that's investable, then we can place that into a company if the scientific founders are interested, or we can create a new company around it. So there's lots of avenues to sort of leverage all the FFB activities. Your second question is if a company is not meeting its milestones, does FFB pull its funding? Not so much on the granting side of the fence for the foundation. You'd have to really screw things up in terms of milestones. Things change, right? I mean, nothing ever works out as you planned it to in the lab, or seldom it does. So we understand that, and we are there to support these grantees as they pivot in different directions. We just want to know, did you conduct the study appropriately? That way we know that if the answer is yes or no, we believe the answer. If it's not conducted properly, and you have no answer at the end of the funding, then it's a waste of time, it's a waste of money. But on the RD fund side, things are set up such that if you do not meet your milestones, you don't receive the next tranche of investment. A lot of our investments are tranched over time, and the ability to call down the second tranche. So if it's a $10 million initial investment and you split it into 2 tranches, a lot of times you'll see it split into 3 or 4 tranches. But just for the easier concept is, let's say there's 2 tranches of $5 million, and the second $5 million tranche is called down once you've met 2 clear milestones. First in human, first patient enrolled in your lead asset, and then maybe an IND clearance to get into a first in human trial for your second asset. Okay, you met those milestones. You've pulled down the second tranche of $5 million, and now you can go execute. But those tranches are in place in case you do not meet your milestone, and you're not putting. It's not dumb money, right? I mean, you're not just throwing money down the drain. It's better to tranche. Now, not all companies do that. We've had a couple of companies who've raised very large sums of money untranched. It's a little dangerous, but it also depends on how big the platform is. If it's a gene therapy program for 1 indication or 2 or 3 indications, well, you kind of know what you're getting yourself into. If it's this huge platform company of gene editing, and they're going after non-ocular indications, we have companies in our portfolio that are going after non-retinal indications. It's fine. I mean, these are generally larger markets. We have one company going after cataracts. We've had companies interested in glaucoma. That's fine. We're not opposed to investing in a company that's going after non-ocular assets. But generally speaking, when we make investments in those companies, we will then have a side letter with that company that says our dollars are going to the ocular assets. So it's another little thread that's not part of, that doesn't answer your question, but it's just another thread that, we want to be, again, above board. We want companies to, and auditors and the IRS to know that we're doing things in a very healthy manner. Our dollars are going straight to retinal research and not other indications. Yes, Dan. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, I was wondering, you said at the beginning that the expectation is for both financial and clinical results. I wonder just what the metrics or measures are like how do you calculate them for ROI, if you will, particularly on the clinical side? How are those derived? How do you set them? What's the process for it?
Yeah, there's no metric per se for clinical success other than the natural progression of clinical trials. Did you meet your primary and secondary endpoints in a phase 1-2? Did you meet your efficacy endpoints in a pivotal or registration trial? And are you granted approval? Those are 3 logical milestones for clinical return, clinical outcomes. And then, the financial outcomes are, classic VC metrics, right? A multiple of the return, and then a time value of return, an IRR. Most people just use the multiple of return, right? So if you invest $1 million, you made 8, then it's an 8x return, right? But that doesn't capture the time value of your investment. So then we'll use So for Videre, for example, we owned 8% in that company, a little over 8%. And that $150 million up front gave us a 4.1x return. but the IRR, the investment rate of return, which takes into consideration the time, we'd only invested this company for less than 18 months. So the IRR was like 400%. It's incredible. You look at a really good VC firm and their performance over time. A good firm may have 5x return on a multiple average across their portfolio, and an IRR of 25 to 50%. So we're still a young portfolio. We only have a few exits. We need to get a few of these companies into the public markets, for example. That's our preferred exit, by the way. If Novartis or Pfizer or somebody buys one of our companies, we lose control over it. It's not a bad thing. They have the resources to take it further. And if we know their teams and trust their teams like we do in Novartis, then it's a good thing. But we just have to understand that going into, and we're very open with our donors about this. That we may lose control, but that's why we take more of an active role in governing our investments so that we can steer them in the right direction. But if you go public, you can grow the company and continue to manage the company. So with impact investing these days, the metrics of return are you're seeing a lot of firms get really clever and sophisticated with how to measure impact. Right now, we're just keeping it real simple. Clinical success is clinical success. Yes, sir. Please do.
So if you're trying to get a return on something, like, and you invested in a company that's developing a treatment for something that's going to treat like a few people realistically, comparatively, but you invested a lot of money into the company, at what point are you expecting a return? Are you even expecting a return at that point?
Yeah, I mean, those decisions are generally made up front. You choose an indication that has a decent market size, and this is how the world works, right? You can't go at it alone. You could, but it would require a lot of capital. We're a small fund, so we need other investors around us. Other investors are, they don't like small markets. So if you're going to go the small market route, like Opus Genetics, for example, we just spun out Opus Genetics, and we founded that company, and we're the lead investor in that company. So we can steer that company with our board governance included in the direction of, okay, we'll tackle an ultra rare, but couple it with a larger market asset. And now you can take 2 or 3 larger market assets and sprinkle a couple of ultra rares in there. Now you're sort of offsetting cash flows, potential cash flows, and costs. Gordon Gunn has always said this. So I love this quote from Gordon that a rising tide lifts all boats. That's kind of where we're headed with Opus. Is let's do our best to address some of the smaller markets because most VC firms are not going to do that. So we need to reduce costs in order to do that. So hopefully in 5 or 10 years, the 2 most significant costs right now for gene therapy, as an example, are manufacturing and obviously the clinical costs. Right now, the manufacturing costs are more expensive than the clinical costs. So we need to reduce manufacturing costs. Clinical costs, it's hard to reduce clinical costs. You can enroll less patients. You can design a study such that you're taking more risk by enrolling fewer patients. That's one way to reduce costs, but that's probably not the right move. So Opus, for example, and a couple of other of our portfolio companies are trying to figure out manufacturing strategies to reduce costs, because for retina, the manufacturing cost in gene therapy as one example, it's it's a scaled down issue for us, right? These are small batch. All you need is, a 10-liter. I know this. I'm throwing out numbers, but forget about what the numbers are. But a 10-liter GMP manufactured gene therapy batch can treat the entire patient population in one indication. Whereas, one of these companies is going after a very large indication via gene therapy that's systemic, requires larger volumes. We just require 100 microliters of, a certain titer in the retina. But these other companies are spending a ton of money to scale up their manufacturing. For us, we need to scale it down. But unfortunately, the costs remain the same. Regardless of, you try to scale down to a 10-liter batch from a 5,000-liter batch, cost doesn't change a whole lot. It still requires the same amount of people, the same quality assurance, the same systems and processes that the FDA requires to manufacture for human use. I like my long-winded questions. Do you? Or answers to your questions. So yeah, we're happy to go in other directions if you'd like. Yes, Ron. And can you do us a favor? I know this is a small
Sure.
audience, but could you introduce yourself? Because you're very important to our foundation.
Oh, sure. My name's Rob Huffnagel. I'm a researcher at the National Eye Institute, and I work with the Foundation Fighting Blindness on a number of different projects, like the consortium with natural history studies, as well as the scientific advisory board. And so we have a lot of fun
Right.
together.
Thank you.
I guess my question is around what is the sort of appropriate stage of the product? Because you mentioned being able to spin off companies and invest in companies, and also a lot of those products might be occurring in a university setting that has its own rules about IP, and these are maybe also NIH-funded projects, which has its own things with IP, and then that might also be complicated by they're also looking for multiple investors, and so what's the stage of product that the R&D fund finds to be, the sweet spot for investing, or does it just sort of just depend on the scenario and
it's an important question. You're getting at a fund's thesis, and every fund needs to be really kind of, they need to advertise their thesis to the general audience so that people know that scientific founders know which investors to approach. For us, we say that we want you to be in the clinic within 18 to 24 months. And so generally speaking, that means that you're in the preclinical stage. You're no longer in the research phase where you're still trying to figure things out. So if it's gene therapy, you may be in an animal model. You're using research grade vector, so there's always questions around that as opposed to GMP or the officially manufactured vectors that the NIH is now getting into. But it's really about what we call IND readiness studies. So you're no longer asking questions: what is the target? What is the construct? How does this work? You've answered those questions. Now and you know this, Rob. This is for the audience. Now you move into this phase of you need to get ready for a first-in-human trial, and you need to show the FDA that you can repeat those early research studies in a very rigorous and reproducible manner under FDA regulations. So everything becomes super tight and regulated at that point. We have invested in some early stage research projects, but we need something that's more investable. We can operate that way if we wanted to as a fund and as an extension of the foundation, natural extension of the foundation, going from grants to these sort of more translational projects. But we need to behave like a traditional VC. And there's enough activity out there. If everything was bottlenecked into research, then we would probably play more in that space. But there's enough activity, and there's so much near clinical stage activity that we can sort of pick and choose. those assets. And I think, most of the investors, to answer the latter part of your question, most of the investors that we syndicate with have similar mindset. They want to see their dollar, because they're addressing these limited partners that we don't need to address, but they want to keep their LPs happy, so that the LP will invest in the next $100 or $200 or $500 million fund. So those LPs are expecting a return on their investment within 3 to 5 years. It rarely happens that they get those wins, right? It's more like 10 years for therapeutics. So they're of the same mindset. We need to be clinically staged. Being in the market, in the private markets, being clinically staged is a game changer, especially in a this is the worst biotech market we've ever experienced. So now what we're seeing is investors favor clinically staged assets, not preclinically staged assets. We have a lot of preclinical stage assets in our portfolio, so it's a concern for us. It's a risk.
Why is this the worst biotech phase we've ever been in?
Part of it is due to inflation and rising interest rates. So when interest rates rise, you can no longer be in that growth mindset, right? You can't borrow money; it's more expensive, right? You want cheap capital when you're an early stage biotech company. Another reason is because there was a bubble created coming out of COVID. Investors, if you watch trends in money flows, just in biotech alone, it's kind of dumb money, right? You've got this capital that just starts chasing activity and trends, and it generally follows, when a sector gets hit, whether it's energy or banks, money moves out of, if it's banking, then money moves out of banking. It goes into staples or whatever, some other asset class. Well, COVID, all of a sudden, with especially how quickly we're able to address COVID, and with all the vaccines, all this it hyped biotech, it hyped life sciences in general. All this money, flooded into biotech, which was great. We had a couple of banner years there, but now that things are correcting and valuations are coming down, interest rates, I think the Fed's going to raise, I don't know if you saw that earlier this week, I think we're going to see another 0.75 basis point Fed hike. There's going to be a ripple effect. There already is. And so, some of the more high-risk biotech plays aren't in favor, as opposed to, because most of the money that's chasing that high-risk biotech play is, they're looking for that big return, right? The failure rate in our space is 80, 90%. But if you hit on that 110%, it can make you a lot of money. Most VC firms behave that way. They expect 1 or 2 wins out of 10 investments. But they want a big win. That's why they like these platform-based companies. There's probably other reasons. I'm a Wall Street Journal guy, so that's all I read. I don't even pay attention to the news in the evenings like my family does. So all I see is what they report. And then, of course, I have a number of biotech journals that I read. It's just part of the flows of capital, in and out of sectors. It'll come back. Biotech will come back. But all of the biotech indices, they are way off of the S&P. If you look at the S&P 500 over the last couple of years, it's pointing. Their curves are pointing up. Our biotech curves are pointing down, and now you're seeing this separation in real time of 50, 60% difference in their growth rates. So, but it'll come back, I'm sure. It always does. It's more important for clinically staged assets that have a shot at the market and profitability, is going to drive, in this environment, is going to drive investment in biotech. So all these preclinical companies that have jumped into the game, based on all this biotech hype, are probably going to suffer. Probably going to see a lot of consolidation, where, even in the public markets, maybe a public company is struggling for similar reasons, and they'll do a reverse merger or a strategic merger with a private company and combine, and now hopefully you've improved the pipeline of that company, and you have a more compelling strategy, that investors will like. They're talking about basketball. I just heard something about basketball.
One quick one.
Yes.
Is that kind of what happened from hearsay with ProQR? They had a couple things in the fire and kind of condensed recently.
Yeah, they're a publicly traded company, so they're very careful to publicize. Anything that I know is in the public domain. So I do not know, and if I did, I wouldn't share it. Anything confidential that's not in the public domain, because anything material can change things for a publicly traded company. But we've made a substantial investment in ProQR for, as I mentioned earlier, a non-dilutive investment. We don't own equity in ProQR, which has obviously suffered greatly. They've lost most of their value. But we did a co-development strategy for an Usher 2A study to get through their phase 2 proof of concept study, which they have, and they're now in a pivotal registration trial called Cirrus. And so, the failure the so-called failure, most of us and who are very close to ProQR don't believe that that's a failure. It's just, again, it's a matter of U.S. regulators and the ophthalmology division of the FDA being a little bit too strict on what they determine as an effect, a statistically meaningful effect. So I think ProQR is in a tough spot right now, but I think that they will. It's going to be data driven at this point, and we're going to have to wait. This Cirrus trial for S2A is a 12-month study, and they're going to enroll approximately 100 patients, I believe, and it takes time to enroll 100 patients. But they have a lot of great sites and a lot of sites that are in our clinical consortium. So to answer your earlier question, this is an example of where we're bringing to bear our resources.
One last. Do you think
Sure.
we're headed back to 2008, 2009 when everything kind of tightened up and funding wasn't as dispersed? Or?
Could be. I wish I had a crystal ball, but it's. They say it's going to get worse. And I've heard a year, I've heard 18 months. There's other market conditions that influence all of this too, right? There's the Ukrainian situation. There's interest rates, of course, and but I don't know. I'm not a doom and gloom person. I'm a long view. But for the company, including the companies in our portfolio who only have 6 or 12 months of cash runway, they're thinking a little bit differently than I am. I'm personally a long view investor, so I don't trade. I'm not about the short term. So yeah, we'll see. A lot of our, we've talked. There's been lots published on this topic recently from big VC firms, Sequoia, RA Capital, and some of their lead general partners. And the message to them is it's too volatile, too unpredictable. All of our companies should tighten up, stop spending, and start thinking about how do you survive for the next 30 days. That should be your mentality. How do I survive for the next 30 days? And so we're talking to our portfolio companies about that. Luckily, we're in really good shape right now. Our portfolio companies are in really good shape. Opus Genetics, the company I mentioned earlier, is probably the most at risk because it only has about 8.5 months cash runway. And here we are talking about a year, 12 months to 18 months of a down market. So we have two new guests who are maybe not familiar with the RD Fund, but we're just doing general Q&A at this point. So feel free to ask any question. And what is our time frame here?
We have time at it ends at 4:15, so
Okay.
we have time for some more questions.
Great. Yes, sir.
One last real quick.
No, it doesn't have to be the last one.
What percentage of funds are from investment and what are from donations? For, say, for the FFP?
So all of our capital is donated. All of it, yeah. But I think maybe we can answer that question by saying, have we received any capital from the return on our investment from the RD fund? And yes, we sold Videri to Novartis, and received approximately $13.5 million up front, and we stand to earn another up to about $22 million. And those dollars are flowing back into the foundation, right? But we've raised, and thanks to Gordon Gunn and a lot of his generous donations, we've raised close to $900 million in our 50-year history. So the percentage coming from the RD fund's only a couple of years old. It's 4 years old this October. So again, our portfolio is young, and we hope to return significantly. We have 4 or 5 companies that are well poised for a return as soon as the public markets open back up. But yeah, small percentage coming from investments at this point. Great questions. Judy, do you have any questions for me?
Was there anything discussed about the research itself? Any promising areas that look exciting right now, and things along those lines?
That's a great question. So dry AMD is unmet at this point across the field. Obviously there's a couple of companies that are in late-stage clinical trials that things look promising. But as a foundation and as the RD fund, we have dry AMD sprinkled in there as sort of second, third indications for some of the therapeutics that are being developed, like Videri, for example, optogenetics. If they prove it out in RP, then they may pursue dry AMD. Dry AMD is a big priority for us. One of the problems with dry AMD is, unlike USH2A or some of the other indications, Stargardt that I mentioned earlier, the genetic identification of dry AMD is very difficult. There's no clear monogenic cause, a single gene cause of dry AMD. Rob may know more than me on this topic, but we're still trying to figure the genetics out. And we will. We'll get it figured out eventually, especially in this day and age of informatics and artificial intelligence. We'll figure it out. And our sequencing is getting stronger and stronger. Our ability to sequence all of the genome and to look for these various causative factors is probably multiple factors, and some of them may be environmental in addition to genetic. So dry AMD is a priority. I mentioned optogenetics as a potential modality that could address dry AMD. Replacement therapies in general are very important to us. So we have a lot of gene editing and RNA therapies and gene augmentation. We have a lot of that going on in our portfolio. But in terms of replacement for late stage progression or disease, vision loss, it's Videri, their optogenetics platform, and then, as I mentioned earlier, Sparing Vision's optogenic asset they acquired from Denise Delcara. So we need more of the cell-based replacement therapies. There's a lot of competition, a lot of companies in that space currently. We're still trying to make sense of it. It's super high risk, right? I mean, the ability to prove that you can culture a photoreceptor and then inject that photoreceptor in the back of the eye, and that photoreceptor engrafts and intercalates, with, as you mentioned earlier, Dan did, with the inner retina, the ability to form the appropriate synaptic junctions with the inner retina, the ganglion cells and the bipolar cells. That's a tough order, but it's quite possible. So I think gene replacement therapies, optogenetics, are going to be very important to our constituents, our donors that are affected, late stage in particular. Yes, sir.
Do therapies that are currently in trials, do they still count as an unmet need, or at what point do you consider them to be transitioned to something that is a met need and no longer needs?
If there's an approved therapeutic and it's effective, then it's meeting a need. A clinical trial phased candidate has not necessarily met a need. It met the need if it was effective in a small cohort of patients, clinical trial participants. So it shows promise to meet the need, but this is about addressing a larger audience. So yeah, sort of a gray area answer to that question. If we, the beauty of a gene therapy trial, for example, is we can see an effect as a secondary endpoint. It's all about safety in these first in human trials, but you can still measure a secondary objective structural and functional outcomes. And if you see an outcome, like we are, for example, with Athena Therapeutics in our portfolio that we helped form and co-funded, they have a very important lead asset called LCA1. And, the data is beautiful. The efficacy data is beautiful. We look at that as with great potential to address a significant unmet need. But they still have to go through a registration trial. But the data is so beautiful that maybe that we can accelerate that registration trial. Fewer patients, smaller time frame, lower costs, is what the VCs want. Another great question. All right. Well, any other last burning questions? I think we have 5 or 10 more minutes. Feel free to throw anything out there.
We talked about sparing vision a little bit at the beginning, so I was wondering, my last recollection is that sparing vision wasn't too far away from beginning to enroll people in their rod-derived cone viability factor trial. Do you know what their current target is?
Yeah, they're close. By the end of the year, they should have a cleared IND. That's the objective. And they've already started I think it's called FINROD, their natural history study for that trial. So it's very important for an indication like that, where it's going to take longer to prove out. This is where design matters, and having the appropriate control arm in an early trial, in this case a natural history control arm, so that you can track patient progression in the untreated patient population, so the real world population. So they're doing all the right things to get ready for that first in human trial. Yeah.
All right. Well, a big round of applause for Dr. Rusty Kelley.
That was fun. Thank you all.
Thank you for joining, everyone. And the next session is going to be genetic testing and counseling and My Retina Tracker, which will begin at 4:20 p.m. in Fiesta 5 and 6.